Hi, I'm Richard Costello, and thank you for tuning in to episode number 7 of the Castler podcast. Today, I'm joined by Caroline Voaden, B2B communications consultant. Caroline, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great you're here. So today, we're going to be talking about a range of topics, including B2B PR in 2025, the importance of connecting your content strategy and PR efforts, and also how small and medium-sized business B2B companies, can utilize PR effectively. But firstly, I thought it'd be great to give listeners a bit more context about who you are and your career and work to date.
Yes, so I am a bit of a communication Swiss Army knife, and that kind of reflects my decade-long experience mostly in agencies, and also, I guess, which we can get onto later, reflects the changing nature of PR. So when I first broke into the industry, I was in a very traditional public relations agency in London. And that was very much kind of what most people probably assume PR, like coming up with stories, ringing up journalists, trying to get into page 1 of the Financial Times, which doesn't always happen. And so I was there for a few years, and I was always in kind of B2B and professional services there. And then I moved out to Australia 3 or 4 years after that, and have been here ever since. Been in a couple of agencies, and that they tended to move into kind of digital PR, and as PR shifted and changed, it kind of became more au fait with content marketing, influencer marketing, social media. And about a year and a half ago, I set up my own business. So now I'm a PR consultant. I also work on content strategy and content writing as well. And I have a part of my business that's more in issues management and crisis PR.
It's great. And you're the second person from Australia, or based in Australia, who has been on the podcast out of 7 episodes so far. So it's great to have that connection. And also like somebody that moved from the UK as well, and then I was thinking about this before the episode, that like you have not only moved all the way to Australia, but also gone out on your own in terms of starting a business, which is, I think, very admirable and courageous to do that. So yeah, diving into the questions then. So first kind of topic area around B2B PR in 2025. So firstly, obviously, well, perhaps not obviously, but for both me and I guess for the audience that perhaps listens to this podcast the most, which is companies that are maybe in the sort of small and medium sized kind of area of B2B, they may not be super familiar with what B2B PR actually is. So I thought it'd be good to start off just with like that high level kind of, what is it for you?
So I like to describe it as the kind of building a foundation of credibility and visibility that enhances your go-to-market or broader marketing strategy. In quite very practical terms, I guess, if to take one of my clients as an example, they're a B2B SaaS patient management system. So they sell into hospitals, and their kind of PR program looks like getting them coverage, kind of thought leadership, as well as news, pick up in trade magazines and kind of the tech trades, as well as kind of hospital trades. It might mean pitching into podcasts, get their execs on podcasts, managing their own blog, pitching for kind of thought leadership blogs within their industry as well. So it's really, enhancing your kind of visibility and your credibility. It's a lot about building trust, especially in today's landscape. And kind of, once you have that foundation, the marketing piece is more effective because people are more likely to already know you, pick up the phone to you, eventually buy from you. So commercial storytelling is another kind of spin I like to put on it. But yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell.
Yeah. And to what extent would you say that PR is about, because this is when I was sort of researching it, and also just my kind of understanding of it is that it's a lot based on getting other people to talk about you and the value of that sort of third party validation. Is that how you would see it, or is it more of just because there was sort of different kind of definitions that I was coming across where some people were just saying it's about just managing perception in the public. And then there was others that are more talking about it's got that real big focus on, other people talking about you and the importance of that.
So I think it depends what stage of business you are in, or a lot of the time it depends on what stage of business you are, kind of your key objectives, but most of the time, yeah, that foundation of trust and that credibility comes from other people talking about you. And that's why I think the stat that all PRs rely on is that public relations earned coverage is 3 times more valuable than paid, so like advertising, for example, because people are more likely to trust that coverage because they know you haven't paid for it. In theory, an independent journalist thinks that, you know, your product or your news or whatever it is, your person has something important to say, and that's why they're covering it rather than you who just paid for that spot. So the value on the trust is the currency in that kind of world. The reputation management side of it tends to be for larger organizations. And that's where a lot more of my kind of crisis PR work and issues management work comes from, where they're being talked about consistently anyway. And so that is more about kind of shaping perceptions in the market that they're already known in, or potentially if you're launching into a new market, that can be a lot of that work can be done there as well. So yeah, it's kind of a bit of both, but I'd say that influence, that getting other people to talk about you is the key.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think for me, there's an example that I think already mentioned on a previous episode, but it's a really good example, I think, of how different marketing tactics at different times combine. So for instance, I got a letter in the post about a business credit card, so from a company called Capital on Tap, which is like one of the sort of quite exciting sort of fast growth fintech companies in the UK, of which there's, I think, quite a few. And so they sent me a letter about saying like, you know, you're eligible for a business credit card. And I was like, something I've been considering, like kept the letter on my desk and just along with lots of other piles of letters and then just left it. Then they sent another one and I was like, okay, like they're really sort of wanting to get small businesses to buy their, to get on their credit card, or I mean, it's not actually a paid product, obviously, unless you take the credit. But then what happened was it stuck in my mind, and then I saw on LinkedIn other people talking about it. So there was this guy who sort of talks. He's called Seb Johnston. I might be making that up. Seb Johnson talks about kind of fintech and also sort of UK tech scene a lot, and he mentioned Capital on Tap and mentioned that they were really successful, and I didn't know that, so it really made a big difference because this was somebody who was obviously unaffiliated talking about the company. And then the other thing that happened at the same time was that I then searched on Google for the company, and they had loads of good reviews. So they're like, I don't know, Trustpilot or Google reviews. I think it was both of those were really good. So effectively what it was this combination of both the letter, because I wouldn't have known if I'd just seen the stuff on my feed, I don't think I'd have just, it wouldn't have registered with me. So it's the fact they had that kind of direct outbound sort of marketing combined with the sort of PR and good reviews and so on, that then combined. And I think that so much of decision making in B2B, like B2B purchasing decisions, are driven in that way, in terms of you've got like some kind of underlying like reputational stuff combined with shorter term like activation tactics, like literally as simple as like sending 2 letters in the post over like 3 months, and then that just like gets you a customer. So
that's when you think about how PR, the landscape has changed so much since I started working in the last 10 years, and a lot of that is the kind of owned, earned and shared media are all kind of merging into one, which is exactly what you're describing there. You know, it's a mixture of tactics, it's a mixture of marketing and PR and probably a bit of sales, all combining together, and thinking a bit more omni-channel and a bit more joined up. Because, in the PR world, it's because, you know, old legacy media is nowhere near as powerful as it used to be. So you've got to find other ways of getting into people's minds, and I guess also in B2B specifically, the different touch points and the amount of decision makers that are in that, often involved in the purchasing decision, if you're thinking a bit larger in B2B, means that you probably need to hit them with a few different ways and a few different tactics before you get them over the line.
Yeah. And you've just sort of touched on the next question a bit, but how has B2B PR changed, and how do you see it continuing to evolve in the future?
So I think what I was just saying then about, so when I first started that first agency, my role was really coming up with storylines with a client, finding data and case studies and that kind of stuff to back up my story, and then constantly ringing journalists and just pitching in to try and get coverage within a newspaper. Like, print is still very valuable. Back then it was kind of king. You always wanted to be in print, and then it would go online the next day in the kind of broadsheets and tier 1. And then in tier 2 we still did a lot of trade media as well, and they all used to have, not so much anymore, physical magazines going out once a month as well. And these days the budget isn't, newsrooms are being cut. There's fewer journalists, especially in regional areas. And I also think as a kind of society, we are a bit less trusting of information sources, and even that extends, I think, to verified kind of media channels. And so kind of all of that means that now PR is really about building trust. It's less about just getting coverage any way you can for the sake of it, and it's less about just news and product launches. There's kind of a more different ways that you need to be able to build trust kind of amongst your different markets. And and then I guess that kind of feeds into the idea that PR is really merged into this omni-channel, this omni-channel tactic where we're thinking about, influencer marketing at the same time, content marketing, social media, they all kind of combine with traditional media relations to kind of create it's called digital PR these days, but it just means combination of lots of different channels, most of which are digital. So I guess it's about, shaping perception across the different channels your audience pays attention to. And at the moment also there's a lot of, there's cost pressure. The kind of economic situation is, kind of a bit uncertain all over the world. And that has led to PR needing to be more aligned with overall business strategy, which is a good thing. Like, it always should be, but it hasn't always been, especially in larger businesses. You can kind of get PR teams working in silos. So yeah. And then I think the other kind of standout how B2B PR has changed is working with larger organizations. It used to just be about what you could get in the headlines and how you could play stories for them. And I'd say these days it's as much about strategic absence sometimes. So that's that perception shaping when you do, when something might be coming up that you maybe don't want on the front page of the Financial Times. So I guess with kind of all those different channels we've got, there's more a bit more of that perception work to be done as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's the point you make about the evolving media landscape that's changed so much. It's PR will be one of those sort of areas that is sort of most impacted by that, I guess, in terms of the move to obviously social media and legacy media becoming less important. And then the other point that you were mentioning about sort of influencers, and increasingly, I mean, one of the things I'm seeing is that a lot of the time now when sort of broadcasters leave a channel, I don't know whether this is happening in Australia, but in the UK, there's a lot of the time the leading broadcasters are leaving the BBC or ITV or Channel 4, etc., and they're just starting their own thing, just on like YouTube or sort of these kind of although in some ways what's happening is that the same sort of, there's a new kind of establishment media arriving that is still quite large, but it's just centered around a kind of stable of like podcasts or shows, but they're hosted on YouTube rather than TV. So there's like the rest is, I don't know if you come across this.
Yeah.
It's very popular in the UK, but like the rest is politics, the rest is history, the rest is, so there's this kind of, and I think they're all linked. I don't know that much about it, but it's ultimately kind of in some ways like a big media company, but it's just got a very different model in terms of they don't have a newspaper or a TV channel. It's all through digital channels. But I mean, to the point about influencer marketing and B2B, that's an interesting topic area. How have you sort of seen that work? What's your view on it?
I think it can be really impactful for sure. And I think in the B2B kind of startup techie space, LinkedIn can be leveraged. If it's leveraged right, it can be really well. Go really well. I was actually just talking to someone earlier who is think he's CMO at Storylane, and they are running an influencer program, and they're getting like 700,000 new leads into the website directly, and they can attribute it directly to that program. Now they do have budget behind it, but they are focusing on micro influencers, which is really interesting because I do think that is a tactic that kind of scrappier startups can lean into a bit more. And it's all about that authenticity, that trust piece. And I think LinkedIn, if it's done well, influencing can feel, or working with influence partners on a kind of paid basis can feel, it feels a bit more authentic than kind of Instagram, where I think people are a bit more able to catch on quickly when someone's being paid. And also actually a lot of the people on LinkedIn, because it's more of a professional marketplace, the influencers are a lot more aligned and a lot more, they're a bit more picky about who they'll work with, and they really have to feel that there's an alignment with what they normally talk about, their values, and they're quite protective of their audience as well. So yeah, it can work really well. The costs can like vary widely. But kind of with micro influencers, if you do the work into figuring out exactly who they're talking to, and you can find out so much great kind of demographic information on LinkedIn, and get really granular with your targeting. It can work really well.
Yeah, I think it probably is one of those areas in B2B that is sort of underutilized, where there's a real opportunity to, and then it'll probably get to a point, maybe like how it has in the B2C side in Instagram, which I don't really know much about, but I'm just imagining it might be sort of, it gets to that point of maturity where it sort of starts to lose its legitimacy, but maybe in B2B it's still got a lot of kind of a way to go. I mean, I've seen a lot more of it on LinkedIn, where there's people that are ambassadors for companies, and they'll actually put that as like a job role. So they'll maybe be a small business owner or something, or even an employee somewhere, but it's often they're a small business owner, and then they've got quite a big following, and then they'll become like an ambassador of a bigger company. It's an interesting model. I mean, certainly I sort of, if somebody wants to sell something to me in B2B, basically the big thing that gets them to do that is other people talking about them on LinkedIn. Like that's sort of, because that's where I kind of go as my sort of like home for B2B stuff and like professional stuff. And then it's like, if you get other people to talk about your stuff on LinkedIn, even if it's kind of slightly transparent that they're being paid, like in some way, that's just really effective. People talking about how they use a particular product or service is powerful.
100%. And I think a kind of a marker or a signal that it's not as mature as the B2C Instagram, that kind of that influencing world, is that this guy I was talking to this morning, he said, because out of interest, I was like, oh, do the micro influencers, do lots of them have talent managers? And he said, no, you need to be kind of 100,000 followers plus to have a talent manager on LinkedIn. Whereas when I used to work, I did a bit of work in B2C when I was younger, and if you have 10,000 followers on Instagram, you probably have a talent manager. So it's definitely kind of there's opportunity there, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then this is probably almost summing up this section, because we've touched on lots of this, but what are you seeing working and not working at the moment in B2B PR?
So at the moment, if thinking about kind of getting journalists to pick up your story, exclusivity is a really kind of number one thing that they will normally ask for. And that's always been the case. Journalists want to write an exclusive story that no one else has. But back in the day, it used to be kind of tier one, top tier publications would be asking for that. Whereas now in trades, or, if blogs have, there are some really dialed in industry blogs. And even they will be asking for exclusives. So if you have a story idea or a launch that you want to try and get up in media, if you can stage your outreach so that you can try and offer an exclusive to a journalist first, I'd definitely recommend that. Proprietary data is another big one. And I think especially if you're a scrappier startup, then it's definitely worth thinking of, rather than spreading your spreading your costs for the year, trying to go kind of always on with PR, it's probably worth thinking about, all right, can we put 80% of our resources into 2 key moments and make sure that we have some proprietary data that we can pitch out for those that might go into a white paper. It doesn't have to be partnering with a company to run a survey. You can survey your customers just by emailing out to your email list and offering a gift card or something. We've done that before to get like a big enough sample size, or kind of digging into your back-end customer data and pulling out some trends that no one else would have access to. That's a really good way of getting some media coverage. Founder-led content, which is kind of that LinkedIn piece that we were just talking to, that builds trust equity a lot faster, especially if you're an unknown company and you don't already have a big name in the market and journalists aren't coming to you. And for example, with LinkedIn, if you can build up your founder's LinkedIn profile, that might help when you're pitching to media to say, oh, he has a big following on LinkedIn, she or he has a big following on LinkedIn, people are interested in what they have to say. And I think the other one probably is trend piggybacking, or news hijacking is another way of phrasing that. And that's really being nimble and prepared to jump on a like a new piece of legislation, a surprise court judgment, or something, kind of a big trend or event that's happening in the world. So like for tariffs, for example, with all the tariff news going on at the moment, there's lots of great PR that's happening where I know because I'm being pitched some of it because I do some writing for some publications, where PRs have quickly worked with their kind of execs or to come up with a couple of comments that they can pitch out to their favorite journalists or journalists that they know are really active in their space, and get coverage up that way, because journalists need to write on those events and those stories. And if you can get into that inbox really quickly, that really is going to propel you kind of up the pecking order and help you get coverage that you might not have got otherwise if you were pitching the same journalist, a new product kind of launch. So there's a kind of some things that are definitely working at the moment.
Yeah, the point about proprietary data and also going for kind of big moments over, like, rather than sort of spreading everything very thinly. I think that resonates a lot, and it just sort of sparked a thought in my head that might be totally way off. But just thinking about with the advent of sort of, I think people talk about answer engine optimization now rather than as like a new way of thinking about SEO. So rather than kind of optimizing for like position in search, or optimizing for position within sort of like an answer from one of the AI sort of chat bot type of interfaces. And one of the things that people are talking about is that the value of that sort of commodity sort of how-to content, or just answering questions. So that was like a kind of, I was reading this book about, it's called They Ask You Answer, I think. It's like a really famous book about sort of SEO and content. Forget the author's name, but basically it's funny, I was reading the edition published in 2019, so kind of just before COVID, and also just before sort of the AI, like no one was using sort of AI chatbots in 2019. So it's all about basically, like, there's a really good way of getting your business out there, which is to basically list out all of the questions that your potential customers will be asking, and then create all of the information for them to make an informed buying decision and put that on your website, including kind of some quite being open about everything. So talking about your competitors, talking about pricing, and that's this kind of model that seemed to kind of work quite well, or very well in some cases, for businesses. And obviously that has sort of, with the fact that now I mean, this guy, who was the author, he was running a pool business, so like a swimming pool installation company. So he would write loads of articles about, like, is it better to get a fiberglass pool or a cement pool, a concrete pool, I should say. And now I just feel as though that sort of model is kind of been really disrupted by AI, that just writing kind of basic-ish how-to content about your topic, people are now just going to go to AI, and that's not necessarily going to then link to your site. So I think that, to your point about sorry, it's quite long-winded, but to get back to your point about sort of the big moments, I think that actually, and also perhaps the role of PR in being of increasing importance, because if you can kind of do something big and have lots of proprietary data, and maybe do your own research, and then also bring in those authority sort of sources and sort of distribution as well through media, whether that's traditional or kind of influencers and so on. Like the power of that in this new world where actually putting lots of content on your website is not as valuable because it's not going to be found as often. So actually that sort of leveraging big moments, proprietary research and data, and then also sort of other sources of authority and distribution could be a really good combination.
100%. I think even the best type, it is changing now, but like a year ago, I think even the best type of SEO, even if it was written for SEO, the best type of thought leadership, like probably had that anyway. Like I know Backlink, what's that company? Backlinko? Is that right? They do they use their proprietary data really, really well, and they don't spend thousands on surveys. They go and look through their database and they just find out. Not their database. They go back and they look at their internal kind of stats about their customers, and will pull out trends. And that kind of content, I think, always performs best in terms of always perform best in terms of searches because it was covering all of EAT, any EEAT, Google's guidance around kind of authentic expert-led content. But even if you think about your publications, to your point, even if you think about your online media, they're not going to. It's less likely that they are going to use your external experts or your execs to answer those kind of how-to questions where they might have 5 years ago. To be completely honest, like it was a lot easier to get those basic topics covered 5 years ago, whereas now they do have other resources like AI. I'm sure they'll start leaning on AI more for that kind of stuff. So yeah, the value of points of difference, I think it is those experts, those case studies, and the data.
Yeah, makes sense. So on to the next sort of question. And when we first spoke to prepare for this episode, you mentioned how businesses' content strategies and PR efforts should be talking to each other. What do you mean by this?
So this is kind of goes back to what I was saying before about how the kind of advent of digital PR and how everything is merging a little bit within the kind of PR and content marketing worlds. And we used to be in silos. So your PR team or your person or your agency would pitch out to media. Your content marketing person would handle kind of thought leadership of blogs, of white papers maybe. And now there's kind of just just a missed opportunity on both sides, because if your PR team gets great coverage, but or you're on a podcast and your exec is on a podcast, you get the clip from it and it doesn't go anywhere. Like you've missed a chance to amplify that content across probably 3 of your different own channels. Whereas if you use use some of that proprietary data, you create a white paper and then it just sits on your homepage or in your resources kind of area of your website, you're missing an opportunity to really leverage that and make it maximize your ROI from each piece of content, but also when you're working in those silos, the messages probably aren't going to align, and that can create confusion in your market, and especially in B2B, like we were talking earlier about the number, I think it's like 13 touch points your average customer goes through in the B2B. And I think it's like 7 to 11 decision makers, or maybe not decision makers, but people from your prospect company, if you're thinking on a kind of larger B2B scale. 7 to 11 people will come across the product internally before someone makes a decision to buy. So the chances of someone, just seeing one blog or, reading one piece in Manufacturers Monthly and then deciding to buy on a kind of B2B timeframes is probably pretty slim. It tends to be, they see ad campaign, and then maybe they read about you in a paper, and then maybe someone on LinkedIn talks about you, and then, oh, the exec's on a podcast that they listen to, and then they get, there's multiple touch points. And if your messages aren't aligned across all of those touch points, that person isn't going to come away with a good idea of who you are and what you offer. So, and when we have all these different channels, PR and content really need to be operate as the same part of the same ecosystem, I think. Yeah. And I guess from a kind of practical point of view for the audience, the way, because I know some people will be like, how do I make that happen? If you have the resources at kind of starting your financial year, your calendar year, whatever you're planning, you're doing for kind of your communication, starting with the communication strategy as kind of your overall strategy, which will kind of step through, like objectives, audience, or key messages, and then tactics, which is where you kind of figure out, all right, we're doing social, we're doing media relations, we're doing sort of blog and white paper. And then you build out those individual plans, but they're all aligned to this overarching strategy, and you've got those key messages. That's kind of how you create consistency across the messages throughout those tactics. But not everyone might have the kind of resources to come up with or develop a communication strategy. So if you're a bit scrappier, I'd say thinking about, okay, make sure you've got your positioning kind of nailed. And then for this quarter or this year, what are the key 3 or 4 key messages or stories that we want to be known for that align with our business goals? And then kind of making sure that the content marketing and PR both are working to those same stories, and maybe sit down like once a month or once a quarter and make sure that kind of your calendars are aligned. And if you've got podcast recording coming up, it's then going to be amplified across these channels. Or if we're running this data for a blog post, make sure that we pitch intermediate first as an exclusive, and then it goes up on the blog. So yeah, that's kind of practically how I put that in place.
Yeah, it makes total sense to do that from how you've explained it. And I think also it seems perhaps connected to also that sort of blurring of the different types of media that you're referring to earlier on. I don't know, in terms of, is that sort of part of why it's important?
Yeah, 100%. There are so many different ways that we all get our information. And I think it's about thinking about where your customers are, and they're probably not just only in one place, right? So the way that, you're going to hit them in the way that you need to with the right key messages at the right time needs to be a kind of coordinated effort. Yeah,
makes sense. And on to some other questions that some B2B PR hot potatoes potentially. So can and should B2B PR be accountable for measurable impact on revenue?
Yeah, so this is a PR's like worst question when a client comes to you and says, how many sales are you going to get me? It's very hard. And it's something that our industry has kind of struggled for a long time. From my point of view, like PR is about that foundation. It's not as direct aligned to sales as, I don't know, performance marketing, for example. It's more of a kind of brand building up that trust equity. So let's say that you were a kind of scrappy startup and you were doing a couple of key pushes a year in PR, and you're pitching out that proprietary data in a white paper. It's going to be very hard for you to prove the value of PR from those 2 moments and in terms of sales. Of course, you want to measure your impact, and there are other ways that PR does that. And I can run through some of those in a minute. I do know of some companies that have really slick CRM setup, where they will track every point of a kind of every customer touch point. It's like with HubSpot, for example, and they can often trace some of their sales back to PR coverage, but you have to have a really slick setup for that. And even then, I don't know if it would be 100% accurate, to be honest. Quite a lot of companies will survey prospects and leads when they're buying. Where did you hear about us? Again, I don't know how accurate that is always, because the person answering is probably going to put down the last place that they saw you rather than, I don't know, 5 touch points ago they read about you in a magazine, for example. But of course, there are you do want to measure your impact. The way that we used to in PR measure our impact was AVE, which I can't remember what the acronym stands for anymore, but it's advertising equivalent. So it's we got this spot for free. You've probably paid someone, of course, to kind of execute the PR tactic, but you get the spot for free versus if you bought this same spot and you paid for it, it would be minimum 3 times the amount. So that is a kind of a way that we used to measure ROI, but it gets a bit vague. You're not relying on 100% accurate data. In terms of other ways, I guess there are probably a combination of metrics that most of us, including me, use to demonstrate impact, and it kind of depends on what your objective is of the PR that you're doing, if it's raising awareness or changing perception. But that tends to be the number of media coverage, reach of the coverage views, sentiment is a big one, key message penetration, and that's basically like, is our CEO quoted in the story, are our 3 key messages that we place throughout, have they been included within the story? Traffic to website is a good one in certain circumstances. So if I work with property developers, if we get a piece of coverage in a local paper, normally you can see a lot more traffic to the website on the day that story or paper kind of drops. Whether you have the right tracking set up to track if it's converted into a sale is a different matter. But you can use a kind of combination of all of those to, I guess, measure your impact, but not really in terms of direct sales. It's how I think about it.
Yeah, it makes sense, and I think attribution is a topic that comes up quite a lot, and I think it's something which over the last kind of 2-3 years, particularly for me, I have evolved in terms of the way I think about it, to basically from looking at my own purchasing decisions to realize how it would either be impossible to know or sort of why I bought something from the B2B company that I'd bought something from, or if they looked at the thing they could measure, it wouldn't have been the actual reason why I did. That was your point about sort of they'd look at that last touch of like they came through a click through on an ad or something like that, rather than the coverage in a magazine or something like that. And that example I talked about with the credit card from Capital on Tap, like they had a code on the letter. So ultimately I kept the letters on my desk and I went back and like used the code or something like that, or the URL on that letter to then, and so they would have been like, right, letters, great, we should do more of those. But actually it was like the fact that their reviews are really good and they also have other people talking about them. That was actually like, without that I wouldn't have done it. And both were actually really essential. So it's not to say that the letter didn't work but it's like, I think that if you only look at what you can measure, it's just a kind of obvious thing, but it just doesn't tell the whole story. But it was also interesting what you were mentioning. You mentioned earlier on in this episode, there was that example where you had the influencer where you give them a specific link and then you can then easily track. I think you mentioned like 700 leads or something like that around that. So I think that there are probably some opportunities where you can do it, but I think it's like probably one of those things where you shouldn't be limited by what you can or can't measure, and prevent yourself from just doing what's kind of sensible, and also, as you were saying as well, measure those broader impacts or kind of other impacts that are sort of other kind of KPIs that are obviously going to be valuable, and just sort of trust that that's going to lead to revenue down the line.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think it's useful, if you can, to use some of those metrics as a bit of a feedback loop, so that you can tweak and you can see the impact you're having. But as you kind of go through the year or kind of the different tactics that you're using. But especially, and also I think B2B, the buying cycles are so long as well. It can be kind of hard to measure and tweak as you go. But I do, feedback loop is a good way to think about it with PR as well, because you can be a bit nimble.
Yeah. And probably like a massive Pandora's box, and I'm conscious of time, but I will ask this. I'll ask these questions, but probably we probably need to move to sort of vaguely kind of quick fire. Just yeah. So, what impact, if any, has AI had on B2B PR?
I think the largest impact it's had is around reporting. There is a lot of reporting work that goes into PR to try and demonstrate the value, as we've discovered, as we just talked about. It's a big topic, so there's a lot of different metrics you can track. There are a lot of media monitoring and sentiment analysis tools out there now, and they are going to speed up that element of the job immeasurably. So yeah, that's probably the largest impact I've seen so far.
That's really interesting, because it's probably, and I kind of like the answer, because it's how sort of we tend to use AI ourselves, in terms of using it for more of the kind of prosaic, like lower sort of value things that are just basically taking something that doesn't involve a great deal of sort of or any kind of human creativity, or sort of so automating things or using AI to make reporting a lot faster and better is seems like a good way of doing things. Again, we've kind of onto the next one. We've kind of already touched on this, but perhaps it's worth just a quick touch on it again. So, should brands focus on high volume content and PR efforts, or focus on fewer, bigger moments?
I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy. Like, I think if you had all of the money in the world, you'd probably do both, to be honest. You'd have an always on level, and then you would also have a few bigger moments throughout the year. Scrappier startups, I would recommend a kind of 80-20 rule. So like I said earlier, kind of 80% of your resources going into a couple of big moments. And that might be spending money on getting research, developing a really bold kind of thought leadership piece, taking time to get case studies and experts aligned, and then maybe seeing if you can host an event on it, a roundtable, that kind of thing, and invite a couple of journalists along. But you don't want to go dark in between those kind of bigger moments. So that the kind of 20%, just maintaining a baseline, consistent level of output, and that might just be on kind of owned and shared channels, not necessarily earned PR channels.
Okay, that makes sense. And then final one then on the sort of PR specific questions. So again, it's probably helpful to maybe think about it in terms of what are the sort of 2 or 3 main sort of takeaways or points that small and medium-sized B2B businesses should be thinking about in terms of when they're using PR effectively.
So I think the first thing is to start with a strategy. I see a lot of scrappier startups kind of jumping into PR tactics without having defined their objectives. And the way that you go about PR should differ depending on whether you want to raise awareness or build your credibility or become known in one market for one thing. So definitely sit down and think about that before you jump into it. And then focus on verticals. And by that, I mean, don't necessarily try and get coverage and be known across all different kind of industries and channels. And don't chase tier 1 media all the time. It's getting harder and harder to get in there. And actually, your trade media, your tier 2 and 3, you might actually, a lot of the time, especially in B2B, you get much more conversion than sales on that, pitching to those types of media. So focus on publications and channels and platforms within a specific vertical. Go there. And then I think the last one, I think that news hijacking thing that I spoke to earlier is another great strategy for kind of SMEs just to keep in mind. And that might look like building relationships with a couple of or 3 or 4 key journalists in your vertical, in your space, taking them out for a coffee just so they know who you are. And then if you know that something big's coming up, like a law change or I don't know, I can't think of another example from my head, but get prepared and be ready to send them a couple of comments, or be on the end of the phone if they need an expert to comment on it on the day.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, and resonates with me, particularly the point about the selecting kind of vertical or sort of more niche media. I think that's probably a lesson that we have learnt over the last year, like for ourselves, in terms of best to sort of focus in on probably our view was probably do less, but with premium and specific to a sort of our domain, rather than kind of more with a broader type of publication or publications, for example. So it makes a lot of sense. And onto the bonus questions. So this doesn't need to be related to PR at all, but just if you could advise B2B businesses to do one thing in their marketing, what would it be?
It would be to use stories as strategic assets. I find in a lot of B2B marketing, people default to kind of features, product updates, industry jargon, but a lot of the time your buyers won't remember kind of your specs. They'll remember how you made them feel. And the best kind of companies, whether it's kind of through PR or otherwise, they make their audiences feel kind of seen, understood, and inspired. And I think strategic storytelling can get you there. It helps build trust, credibility, helps you stand out. They're sticky. Stories are sticky. So yeah, I definitely think that's a bit of a trick that some B2Bs are missing.
And what sort of could you think of an example, provide an example around sort of what that looks like in practice? Under conscious, you might need to sort of anonymize it in some way, but yeah, but it's a really interesting point.
I think it's so in your content marketing, so even if you're kind of stepping into PR and actually in content marketing, just a lot of founders will default on their website, even if they're just writing kind of news and views, they will just talk about their latest product launch, the latest version of their product, that kind of thing. Whereas I think what is going to get you further quicker is if you're talking about an industry challenge, or when you're writing content marketing, you're talking to pain points, not features, which is kind of foundational stuff. But I still do think that the use of kind of stories and framing things in a kind of a way that connects emotionally with your reader is missing in B2B land sometimes. Yeah,
it makes sense. Yeah, I think it's probably something I don't naturally find easy. I think I'm somebody that looks at things in a very kind of like direct, like what does it do? And so probably, but I think, it makes a lot of sense. And finally, what's your most contrarian take when it comes to B2B marketing?
So I've been thinking a lot lately about how, as marketers, we have maybe let the side down a bit and focused a lot on too much on sales and not enough on brand building. And this might be I do work a lot in the B2B tech space. And I've definitely found, and I know a lot of my other peers have found, that a lot of marketing and sales is kind of mushed at the moment. And a lot of tactics and kind of campaigns are being run like purely off sales objectives, which 100% is needed, don't get me wrong. But I think we are not talking about the value of longer term brand building and I guess the equity that buys in the market. I think without it, most B2Bs hit a plateau. Or not most, some B2Bs hit a plateau.
No, it 100% resonates. And actually, I think that sort of way of seeing B2B marketing, I think, is becoming more. I've seen this more and more on LinkedIn. There's a couple of people. There's a guy called Liam. I forget his surname, but he comes up on my feed quite a lot. I think I follow him, and I think is CEO of Storybook Marketing. I think something like that. And he and a few other people. This is kind of small, but perhaps growing movement, perhaps in B2B marketing, which is really much more focused on brand and talking about just common sense things about the fact that you can't just focus on, to the points that we were talking about, you can't just focus on what can be measured. Things are complicated, and you just need to embrace that, because I think that particularly with the fact that it has been a difficult sort of 2-3 years perhaps sort of in the B2B tech space, particularly after that sort of COVID boom sort of, or the disruption, and then the kind of boom that happened a lot with tech in kind of 2021. Post then, it's been quite tricky. And then I think what is causing is a lot of people to rethink and sort of just like almost like revisit what B2B marketing actually is, because of those things, that those old models, whether it's inbound or outbound, whether it's paid or not, are all kind of like they've been really creaking over the last couple of years. And so people are kind of going back to what actually fundamentally is important. And so, which is really refreshing. It's just probably, it's taken a lot of kind of pain and sort of trouble to get to that point, I think, in the sort of the industry.
Yeah, I'll have to go find them. My LinkedIn feed is not
add a
full
couple
of
of things in the. I can add a couple of links in the show notes to. There's a woman, I forget her name, but I also follow her, and she is also often sort of banging that drum as well. And then there's another guy who has a newsletter, I think called like Burn It Down. It's like a really it's really interesting, but he's like sort of almost like this kind of conspiracy theorist about B2B, like, but all about B2B marketing and the sort of the data platform. So he's saying that like ZoomInfo, Apollo, and the intent data platforms and so on are all kind of like sort of taking everyone's data and then just selling it back to them. And he's got this kind of really like, it's a bit sort of like tinfoil hat in a B2B way, but in a quite like a sort of compelling and interesting way. So it's worth a read. I can add that in as well. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on. It's been really great to hear your thoughts, and it's also good that the internet seems to have held up across the however many thousand miles it is that we're away from one another. And if people want to keep in touch with you, what's the best way for people to do that?
I'm Caroline Voaden on LinkedIn. That is where I hang out most of the time. Or my website is storycopywriting.co.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'll add that to the show notes as well. Well, brilliant. Thanks so much. And yeah, we'll speak soon.
Thanks so much for having me.